After weathering the counterattack, everything returns to semi-normal, at least what considers normal outside the gate. Training continues with everyone as they start to understand their new abilities more and more, and of course how to control it. Bringing in all sorts of refugees from the battle made things interesting, seeing all the non-humans around, though the non-humans were more afraid of what was coming through the gate and being assembled in front of them. By the time 6 months was over, 2 battalions of armor were already set up, 2 battalions of infantry, an entire battalion of air support, half of which were from the Night Stalkers, and an entire support battalion were already inside the gate. This took a long time, seeing as you can't bring anything super large in, so a lot of vehicles had to be brought in piecemeal. Thankfully, they could bring the engines and transmissions in one go, but that didn't help if you couldn't get the chassis in. In many cases, the chassis had to be forged on the other side of the gate. Thankfully, this was not undoable, but was still just difficult. However, once a vehicle was actually up and operating, things sped along much, much faster. The support battalions became experts at working with all those around, all those they considered monsters or beastmen or half human, half something or other. There was all sorts of different phrases, most of which were not exactly flattering. However, they did help out a lot. Many of the former slaves were very interested in learning human techniques. They wanted to know how to repair, how to build, and one thing they definitely wanted to learn was how to farm. They couldn't understand humans bringing in so much food. How could they have such a plethora of food that came in? They usually had to forage for everything. They had to hunt for their fish and their meat. They didn't farm, they didn't raise livestock, although nothing in their own forest could be considered livestock. Everything there, from the ants to the rabbits to the deer to the bears to the boar, everything was ready to kill you, so you simply had to kill it first. Many of the smaller species were able to handle with this with having simple bows and being able to hit the spots necessary to take anything down. But to feed a group this large was going to take more than anything they could hunt in their own time. This is where the humans helped out. Not only did they bring in food to sustain everybody, but they also used their own equipment to clear the land and prep it for farming. As it turned out, the soil itself was extremely rich, to the point where those that had actually grown up farming were enjoying the fact that they had assembled a tractor and had plowed and tilled fields and began to plant everything, and they were enjoying harvest of the first few vegetables they could get to operate. Though many of the seeds were not taken from Earth itself, they had to be taken from the surrounding area. It was still nice to see that they had different types of fruits and vegetables beginning to grow, entire orchards where saplings were growing. It was interesting to see. And of course, it raised morale up almost as much as other things that were happening. Around the town, they were rebuilding. They were putting up new buildings, again with human technology and human equipment, able to lift and move things a whole lot faster. They were able to build new buildings even stronger than they had before. They were able to even start with textiles, which definitely helped out since many of the soldiers sometimes didn't know which way to look and honestly didn't want to see certain things swinging in front of them, especially from some of these slaves who were a lot larger, standing sometimes 10 and 15 feet tall, which meant certain things were right about eye level. They needed something to get that out of the way. Not to mention, they had to bring in a whole bunch of hygiene equipment and teach the locals that, being clean is a good thing. It wasn't as though they didn't know anything about hygiene. They enjoyed a bath. They enjoyed a good shower. They enjoyed being clean. The problem is the royalty, the goblins themselves, had restricted this to only themselves. They had said it is only for those worthy, and they had taught this to all the slaves for several generations. With this, many of the humans simply rolled their eyes and made up a makeshift bath for many to enjoy. Definitely for the kids, as they needed to be as clean as possible so they didn't get infections. Though that was kind of impossible considering once you were around a human, getting an infection was kind of, not even a thought. However, being clean and feeling somewhat refreshed really helped out morale. While all this was going on, the military was also busy. They had sent out drones to search for the goblin armies to see if they were reforming, if there was going to be another attack. To their surprise, there was no rallying areas, there was no camps, there was no nothing in any direction. They couldn't figure out why. So eventually, they looked and could see that the goblins had retreated to their castle area. The surrounding towns were basically slapboard houses, made of mud and grass. Most everyone there was just treated not even like a serf, but just a slave. They couldn't leave, as many of them were bound by their collars. They couldn't get out. They weren't able to hunt, so they were very malnutritious. Even though they sent many of their hunters out, they would come back with sometimes large kills, but those were immediately grabbed by the castle guards themselves and brought in to the goblins. The goblins ate well. Goblins didn't need to. In fact, if they ate too much, they got so bulbous they couldn't move. Yet goblins themselves were a bit girthy by nature. Very few times would you see one that was actually very, very thin by nature. They noticed this as they began to catch the messengers that were going from other goblin kingdoms to other goblin kingdoms. They wanted to see what was going on. They originally tried to sneak up and just steal the bags, but the goblins' sense of hearing and smell was difficult to get around. They could smell soap very, very easy. Many of the scouts had to put themselves out into the woods, bury their clothing in the dirt for several days to get the smell off, and still it was difficult. However, they did find one thing that did help a lot. Good old-fashioned chloroform. For some reason, due to the goblins' extremely strong sense of smell, as soon as they sniffed the chloroform, to them it was kind of a sweet smell, but it did put them to sleep rather quick. Not nearly as well as ether, though. Ether made them higher than a dictator's child. It was absolutely hilarious to watch. And yes, they brought many videos back, as some of these goblins would be so confused and so out of their wits that they would try mating with a rose bush, or whatever you can be considered. Yes, they would come off their high and realize they had thorns sticking out of their junk. This usually would make them scream and yell and not realize what the hell had gone on. While they were out of it, those that had put them into such a stupor had snuck into their satchels and started to look through the correspondence. It's not surprising that they were begging for help from the other goblin kings, and including the goblin emperor, begging for help to push back, as they put, those unclean and unworthy of even being slaves, those that would defy our greatness, and yada 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 yada. This was pretty much what everyone figured from all dictators. However, the kings were only getting certain responses back. They were getting responses that they would get reserve soldiers, they would get warriors, they would get mages, they would get slaves to help them out. However, in return, they would give the other kings lands, they would give them slaves, titles, and of course, women. Many of these demands, even to someone who didn't know the way the social structure was, would realize this was far too much. As they started talking about land masses that covered entire counties, almost the size of small states. One even demanded a size of land the equivalent of France. This was clearly too much. Along with that, we found out very quick by talking to those who had been slaves that when they demanded women, this was also too much, as the females of the species, along with the slaves, were kept for those of goblin blood only. They were brought in, they were sold, auctioned off, sometimes traded, used for other nefarious purposes, which everyone tried to keep the lid on for as long as possible. The scout teams were able to check out the castle, though it took a long time to actually get in. They also used the intel to actually traverse their way around the castle area. They found out that the females were used as barter, payment and reward for their warriors. and all that, but they were kept inside the castle, very, very hidden. Eventually, the scouts were able to get in close. They got in so close they were able to get video of the female slaves being treated poorly. In fact, they were almost as treated as poorly as the male slaves. The male slaves, say a young one, maybe 2 or 3 years old, if it even asked for water, it would be struck so hard that many times there would cause irreparable damage. In one case, one of the scout members almost lost consciousness as he watched one of these young ones get kicked across the face, a small reptilian, and it no longer had a jaw. The jaw had been taken off by a warrior-class goblin. With this, everyone was pissed. "You don't hurt kids, asshole," was something that could be heard inside the video itself. As they continued to look for a way to get inside the castle, get the slaves out, and take the castle down, they came up with a problem. The problem is that the hallways, the rooms, everything was set up specifically for goblins, which meant they were roughly half, maybe 60% that of what humans usually used. So infiltrating was going to be very difficult. Yet thankfully, those on the scouting teams were able to do so. Of course, this is what they trained for. They were able to get video of the women inside being forcibly impregnated, even while their young children watched, unknowing what's going on. All they knew was that their mother was being injured. And when the videos finally were, quote-unquote, leaked, now everyone was pissed, and a plan of action was demanded and eventually executed. The plan was fairly simple. They had to get the slaves out. They couldn't just level everything. They had to get them out. The infantry would sneak in. The king was far too secured, especially in those small hallways where you can barely freaking move. Even trying to wave around an MP5 is difficult at best. And they can't afford to be caught, not too early. If they are, the whole plan goes to hell in a handcart very, very quick. They used the cover of night, bringing a few of their more monstrous translators. They had to keep holding them back, the translators wanting to drive in and take out as many goblins as possible, but they kept being told, "Shh, you'll get your chance, just relax." Eventually, they got through, snapping a few necks, almost like killing the sleeping grunts of Halo, as they walked up, grabbed the goblin by the throat, and all you could hear was and that was it. They left the body there. They didn't need any of the gear or anything like that. They just left it. They were in a hurry, after all. As they got to the slave holding areas, they secured all of them. The slaves, of course, were scared to death when they saw the humans standing straight up. They knew this wasn't a warrior-class goblin, but then again, it was covered in some sort of paint. They didn't know what it was. They also saw this strange uniform that was green like a goblin, so they feared that the goblins had come back to do more damage. But this time, no. The slaves saw something else, something they had only heard of in legends and from the guards that seemed to gossip a lot, as guards do. The translators had to be used, since many of the soldiers only had a tenuous grasp on the common tongue language of this universe. With that, the translators told the slaves that they were going to be freed and they needed to be as quiet as possible. Along with that, they made it to the females' area, and they were able to get the females to follow them out. Many of them so completely brainwashed and waxed that they didn't want to go. And in some cases, a soldier would simply walk up to the woman who still had the child in their arms, pick up the woman with one arm, reach over, grab another one, and they continued to walk out. They just got as fast as they could to the rallying points. The rallying points for those inside the castle were just inside the center wall, right next to the doorways. They knew as soon as everything started off, they had to run. The slave holding areas were a lot easier since they were outside the main wall, but they were still fairly guarded. It was going to be a mad dash with everyone as fast as they could, trying as they could get to any type of transport. The transport had to be waiting. If it wasn't, this whole plan was gone. At the exact right time, everybody inside told the slaves and the freed females to get down, get down. They waved for everybody to get down. They didn't understand why until they saw those in the strange face paint and the green uniforms actually get down themselves and cover their head. They all simulated this, and then there was an explosion. Something had happened. The gate itself, the drawbridge mechanism, had been blown to pieces, and the bridge was falling now. Along with that, a grenade, what they didn't know, had been ignited. A thermite grenade was now melting chains that hold the gate up. Now it will never move again. It will always be there, and they have a clear run. With that, they all ran like hell. They followed these strange beings as fast as they possibly could, as they all made a beeline for where they had to go. As they did, the explosion had woke up every single guard in the castle, and they could hear the giant gongs being hit, signaling there was an attack. And as they ran, a few arrows began to fly. Then a few more, then a few more, then guards came out with swords drawn, axes raised, and they were immediately shot down. This made many of the humans stumble as they felt themselves begin to lose their ability to run. But they kept going, pushing through the exhaustion with everything they had. One of the slaves on the outside took an arrow to the leg. The human ran up, picked up the young man who couldn't have been more than 10 years old, at least by the human eyes, raised him up, threw him over the shoulder, and with the other hand ripped the arrow out of his leg. The child screamed and then, within a few seconds, realized that there wasn't much pain anymore, and a few seconds later, there wasn't any pain. With this, he was slung down again towards the bottom as they continued to run. He didn't realize it, but his leg had completely healed. Still dumbfounded, the human grabbed his arm and pulled him along, yelling something he didn't know, but it sounded a whole lot like, "Run, you dumbass!" As those ran from the castle, those inside the castle realized that the females were being taken, and there was no way they were going to lose a resource like that. Those inside tried desperately to keep themselves from getting fired upon, but it was not going to happen. Those in the turrets and on the walls began to fire down on them with arrows. Crossbow bolts came out as well. Also, many of the mages began to show up, groggy as hell from being woken up, but realizing what the hell was happening. Eventually, several of the slaves were pushed out as many of the soldiers on the inside pulled on either side, weapons raised, and began to fire. Though the suppressor kept many of the loud noises down, still the sound echoed throughout the stones that held up the wall. Many of those on the walls believed that humans were casting a magic spell of thunder and began to run, scared. However, others realized that these were bullets, these were projectiles, this was a ballistic weapon, and they had to stop them. Eventually, one of the humans was hit. Others moved into position around them to cover him, firing desperately at anyone there was, as they could see much better due to the fact they had night vision on. It was the only reason they weren't covered in arrows, and they were also able to knock down more and more of the guards as they ran out. As they started to run as fast as they could, they also went past another group of slaves and females that had been hit, many of them with twisted ankles falling down, and they were barely on the edge. Many of the humans started to get drowsy and began to fall onto one leg. The slaves looked over and were concerned, and the soldiers just looked up and laughed. That strange grin that came across their face as they reached in, pulled out a strange tube, popped off the top, and then drove it into their legs. They didn't know what these creatures had just said, but they realized they had all said the same thing. "Wow, adrenaline! Woo!" With that, the humans were back on their feet and faster than ever. They ran out, and just as the last of them left, they began to spray, not even caring if they hit anything at this point. It was just suppressive fire. But just as they got all them out, the attack happened in earnest. The slaves must have thought their own thunder god had come down to rain hell upon the castle as the tanks adjusted their turrets and began to fire volleys into the walls, taking down the turrets and most of the structures as they did, firing high explosive anti-tank rounds specifically to blow them up. Forget about anything that needs to pierce. They also went and got their HE shells and began to aim very low on the walls, and eventually it began to crumble. They couldn't bring any artillery, but mortars work just fine, and mortars were also lobbed over the wall to try and suppress those inside. They knew that magic could be used to reinforce the walls, and they needed to keep the mages back while the tanks did their work. Eventually, 20% of the wall came down, and the tanks adjusted fire to aim farther out, aiming more on the top of the wall to keep those ballistas from firing. Then a full assault came as the infantry charged in. They had a whole legion of their own freed slaves in tow. They were told to stay behind the humans as the humans didn't want to shoot them. But the humans realized that there was no point in trying to slow them down. As the half-humans, half-goblins, half-whatever in the hell they might be, started ripping apart all the guards inside the walls, looking for any other slaves to free, the humans went room to room. Though they had to duck down and basically had to crouch the entire way, they were able to bust through the doors with one hit, breaking in, rolling in, scaring the living shit out of anyone who was there, in some cases literally, as they began to blast through. In some cases they didn't have to. They just swung their weapons, and with a massive burst they threw the goblin against the wall, breaking several of its bones in the process. This, of course, made many of the humans have to reach for those tubes again. The auto-injectors did exactly what they needed to be doing. Before full dawn that morning, the castle had fallen. Every single room had been cleared, from the top of the turrets and towers to the deepest part of their dungeons. Everything had been cleared with ruthless efficiency, and the king was being dragged out in chains, old, raggedy chains that chafed into his wrists. He was brought over to all the rest that were captured and simply thrown in with them, a disgrace to him. The king then screamed out, how could they possibly do this? How could they possibly take them down with such a small force? As he looked at the humans, and the humans were outnumbered at least 5-1. One of the humans had his translator turned on, and he could, after a few seconds, understand what the king had said. He spoke into the translator, and of course there was a delay, but the response that he got was, "This is what happens when you have a legion of monsters determined to take your life." He motioned over to all those that used to be slaves, and then he simply walked away. One of the former slaves, clearly partial goblin, half if not 3/4, but much larger than the king, reached over and picked him up and began to choke the life out of the king. And as he left this world, the last thing he saw was this former slave smiling menacingly at him, saying how he has fallen from king to slave, and how he has failed all the rest of the goblin kingdoms. This was the last thing he knew before the light left his eyes. The body was dropped, and the slave just spat on him. After that time, humanity as a whole realized that it was not their place to conquer this world. If they tried, they would lose more than they ever wanted to. So it was decided they would leave this castle area, and they would only control the small area around the gate, along with everything in about 5 to 10 kilometers in any direction. They left the castle, they left the area for all the freed slaves and all the females, of course. They knew that this would bring some growing pains, but it was their world, not humanity's. Though the humans would help them rebuild the castle to defend themselves, they brought up the fact that the castle itself might not be exactly designed for its new inhabitants. All the rest of the inhabitants simply looked and asked if the humans could remove it from this world. It was an eyesore. It was designed for the goblins themselves and no others, and they could not have something like that. When the human commander turned over, they just saw one of the other humans pick up this strange device and put it to his face. And he started his own strange conversation by saying something that the slaves had heard before but still don't understand. Fire mission. Eventually, trapping more correspondence, they were able to find out that the other empires were thinking that they needed to retake the area. Even though they had lost their castle, it could be rebuilt, though it would take a lot of time and a lot of slave labor, which is something that the goblins definitely had in abundance. They did send one message, one single messenger, to the humans. Of course, the messenger was scared to death as they saw several humans walking up, towering over his little body. He was absolutely shaking as he handed the letter over, and then handed his hand out as though he was expecting a gold coin or something. Translated to his language, he was told by the humans, just be thankful we don't kill you where you stand. The message was sent to everybody to show them what the goblins thought of us all. They demanded that we surrender immediately and surrender all our technology, all our slaves, and to willingly put on shackles, as we do not have a chance of survival now that we are the common enemy. They ended it with surrender and abandon all hope. The commander that read this to everybody had a simple retort. As he looked over, tapped on the barrel of one of the M1 Abrams that was next to him, he simply said, "Abandon all hope, my ass."